France. The year is 1793, and the world is on fire. Not the slow, smoldering fire of discontent, but the roaring, all-consuming blaze of revolution. A fire that had been building for generations beneath the cobblestones of Paris, beneath the velvet slippers of kings, beneath the starving silence of millions of people who had nothing left to lose. On the 21st of January 1793, King Louis XVI, monarch of France, descendant of centuries of royal blood, walked calmly to a wooden platform in the heart of Paris. The crowd was enormous. Thousands upon thousands of citizens pressed against one another in the cold morning air, their breath rising in white clouds, their voices rising in anticipation. The blade fell, and in one single irreversible moment the old world ended. The people cheered. They believed truly, deeply believed, that they were building something new, something better, a republic. A nation founded not on the divine right of kings, but on three sacred words: liberty, equality, fraternity. But revolutions are hungry things, and this one had already begun to devour its own children. What followed was not the dawn of freedom the people had dreamed of. What followed was the reign of terror, such violent, relentless suspicion that neighbor turned against neighbor, friend turned against friend, and the very men who had lit the torch of liberty used it to burn everything around them. The guillotine worked without rest. Heads fell daily. The prisons overflowed. Accusation was enough to condemn a man. Fear was the law of the land, and in the provinces, far from the speeches of Paris, far from the grand halls of the National Convention, a civil war was tearing France apart at its very roots. In the Vendée region of western France, the royalist rebels rose up, farmers, priests, noblemen, ordinary people who clung to the old ways, to the old faith, to the old king. They called themselves the Catholic and Royal Army. They fought with fierce desperation in the forests and marshes of their homeland, holding back the tide of the new republic with everything they had. It was here in the Vendée, in the mud and blood and burning villages of this ancient land, that Victor Hugo set his great novel of humanity. And it's here that our story begins. The Republican battalion had been marching for days, through dense, dripping forests where the trees grew so close together that sunlight barely touched the ground, through narrow, winding paths where the air smelled of pine resin and damp earth and the ever-present ghost of smoke, through a landscape that seemed to hold its breath, watching, waiting. These were hardened men, soldiers who had seen enough of war to have lost count of what they had seen, men whose boots were worn through and whose bellies were rarely full, and whose hearts had been scraped clean of anything soft, months of fighting in this brutal, beautiful, terrible countryside. And yet among these soldiers walked something that did not belong to war at all. 3 children, René Jean, Gros Alain, and little Georgette. The oldest was perhaps 4, the youngest barely old enough to walk on her own. They had been found wandering in the forest, lost, terrified, thin as winter branches, in the middle of this storm of blood and fire. Nobody knew exactly how they had come to be there. War does not explain itself. War simply takes. But Sergeant Redoub had found them. Redoub was not a soft man. He was a soldier's soldier, broad-shouldered, scarred, with a voice like gravel rolling down a hill and hands that had held a rifle. For so long they had forgotten what peace felt like. He had no children of his own. He had no family waiting for him anywhere. He was a man shaped entirely by the army, for the army of the army. And yet, when he found those 3 small children alone in the forest, something shifted inside him. Something ancient and instinctive and fiercely protective came roaring to life. He picked up Gros Alain and set the boy on his broad shoulders like it was the most natural thing in the world. His comrades, soldiers just as rough, just as battle-worn, did the same without a word. One took René Jean. Another held little Georgette. And beside them walked the children's mother, Michelle Fléchard, a woman so exhausted that she moved like a shadow of herself, her face hollowed out by days of running and hiding, her eyes dull with a fear that had gone on too long. But as she walked beside these soldiers, these strangers who had become, in some impossible way, her family, a new light began to kindle in her eyes, something like hope, something like safety. Something she had almost forgotten the feeling of. Ahead of them, the towers of the fortress of La Tourgue rose against the sky, ancient, massive, unyielding. The fortress was built of stone so old it seemed to remember a time before France itself existed. Its walls were thick enough to swallow cannonballs. Its towers rose high enough to look down on the surrounding forest, like a king surveying a conquered country. La Tourgue was one of the last great strongholds of the royalist resistance, a symbol of everything the old world still clung to. Even as the new world closed in around it, a thin thread of smoke was already rising from somewhere within its walls. The air tightened. Everyone knew a battle was coming. Two men rode up on horseback. The first was young, barely past his 20s, with the kind of face that people trust instinctively. His name was Gauvain. He was a commander in the Republican Army, and he burned with the pure, bright flame of a man who genuinely believes in the cause he is fighting for. Not politically, not strategically, morally. Gauvain believed in justice, in mercy, in the fundamental dignity of every human being. He was the kind of man that wars produce rarely and destroy quickly. He looked at the three small children, and his eyes warmed with something uncomplicated and real. The second man was older, harder, and colder. His name was Simmerdain. Simmerdain had once been a priest, a man of God who had traded his faith in heaven for a faith in the revolution. He was Gauvain's mentor, his teacher, the man who had shaped him from boyhood. And he loved Gauvain the way hard men love, silently, fiercely, and with a steel grip that could not bend. He looked at the three children with flat, practical eyes. These children were caught in the war, he said evenly. But now they are under the protection of the revolution. Redoub looked up, and something in his rough face had gone completely soft. They are my children now, he said simply, and Michelle is their mother. In the middle of a war that had made monsters of men, a family had been born. The soldiers shared their meager rations. Someone produced a blanket, and for a brief, extraordinary, utterly improbable hour, laughter could be heard near the camp. The sound of children laughing. The sound of soldiers forgetting, for just a moment, that they were soldiers at all. Redoub sat with them as the sun climbed higher, telling them gentle stories, tales of brave men and kind villages, of animals in the forest and boats on the river. He sang to them in a voice that was not made for singing, but that sang anyway. Michelle watched with tears sliding silently down her hollow cheeks. For the first time in days that had felt like years, the children felt safe. It was beautiful. It was heartbreaking, because it could not last. The flames came without warning. One moment, La Tourgue stood dark and massive against the sky. The next, bright orange fire erupted from deep within its walls, a roaring, hungry blaze that lit the morning like a second sunrise and sent columns of black smoke boiling upward into the golden air. Inside that burning fortress were the three children. Nobody knew exactly how it happened. In the chaos of war, details have a way of disappearing into the smoke. What mattered, the only thing that mattered, was that René Jean, Gros Alain, and little Georgette were inside a burning building, and the fire was spreading fast. Redoub's face went white. Then it went red. Then it went to something beyond expression entirely, the face of a man who has discovered, in the worst possible moment, exactly how much he loves something. We have to save them. His voice cracked across the camp like a rifle shot. The soldiers moved toward the fortress walls, but the fire was ahead of them. The stones were hot. The smoke was thickening by the second, pouring from every window, every gap in the ancient masonry. The stairs inside were already catching. It seemed impossible. It seemed like the kind of moment where history writes a tragedy and moves on. And then, from inside the fortress, from somewhere deep within the smoke and the roar of burning timber, came a figure old, straight-backed, moving with the deliberate, unhurried dignity of a man who has made a decision and will not be stopped by anything as small as fire. His name was the Marquis de Lantenac. He was the commander of the royalist forces inside La Tourgue. He was an old man of the old world, aristocratic, unyielding, utterly convinced of the rightness of his cause. He had fought against the revolution with the cold, methodical efficiency of a man who feels no particular need to explain himself. He had ordered the fire set himself, as a tactical maneuver to cover the escape of his men through the smoke. He had done what war required, and now, from a high window in the blazing tower, he looked down, and he saw the children. 3 small figures, visible through a gap in the smoke, terrified, crying, surrounded by the gathering distant fire. Something happened inside the Marquis de Lantenac in that moment that he could not have predicted and could not have explained. His entire life, his convictions, his loyalties, his identity as a soldier and a nobleman and a champion of the monarchy, all of it fell completely silent. What remained was something older than politics. Something older than revolution or monarchy or any human cause ever dreamed up by any human mind, he whispered to himself. His voice was barely audible above the roar of the fire. These are innocent children, Don. A pause, one breath. I cannot let them die. The Marquis de Lantenac turned back into the burning fortress. He moved through smoke that would have stopped a younger man. He moved through heat that pressed against his face and hands like something alive and hungry. He moved through the collapse and chaos of a building dying around him, and he found the children, and he carried them, one by one, and then together, with the last reserves of strength that an old man's body could produce, down the burning stairs, through the thickening smoke, and out into the clean morning air. He placed them in Redoub's waiting arms. And then he straightened and stood, and breathed. The old warrior had shown mercy. In the middle of everything, in the middle of the fire and the war and the hatred and the impossible weight of history, he had simply chosen to be human. Gauvain had watched it all from the hill above. He had seen every moment, the fire, the smoke, the old man walking back into the flames, the children brought safely out, all of it, and he had recognized the man who carried them. The Marquis de Lantenac was his uncle, blood of his blood, the man who had bounced him on his knee as a boy, the enemy he had been hunting through these forests for months, the symbol of everything the revolution stood against. And the man who had just risked his life to save 3 children who meant nothing to him, strategically, politically, or practically. The storm inside Gauvain was unlike anything a battlefield had ever produced. Simordain stood at his shoulder, and his voice was iron. Revolution comes first, Gauvain. Do not forget what you are fighting for. Do not forget what is required of you. Do not forget nothing for a long moment. He looked at the children in Redoub's arms, safe, alive, crying with relief. He looked at Lantenac, standing in the smoke, old and dignified and entirely still. He looked at his mentor, whose face was carved from the granite of absolute conviction. And then, very quietly, the Gauvain said, "Humanity is the greatest thing of all." He walked down the hill. He stood face to face with the Marquis de Lantenac, his enemy, his uncle, the man who had just done the most human thing Gauvain had ever witnessed. And he said 4 words that would cost him everything. "I am letting you go." Simordain's voice came from somewhere above and behind him, cracked with disbelief and fury. "This is treason." Gauvain turned calmly. "No," he said. "This is humanity." Lantenac looked at his nephew for a long moment. Something passed between them that had no name in any political vocabulary, something that existed only in the wordless space between 2 men who understand each other, across every divide. "You have freed me," the old Marquis said quietly. "The monarchy will never die." "Go," said Gauvain. "Humanity has saved you today." And Lantenac walked away into the deep, dark forest. There are moments in history where a single act of mercy costs everything. Gauvain was arrested before the sun had moved much further across the sky. The charge was treason. The penalty was death. There would be no appeal, no delay. No softening of the law on behalf of youth or courage or the purity of the intention behind the act. The trial was swift, and it was Simordain who pronounced the sentence. Simordain, the man who had taught Gauvain to read, the man who had shaped his mind and his conscience and his love of justice. The man who, in every way that mattered, was his father. It was Simordain who stood before his adopted son and condemned him to guillotine in the name of the revolution he had given his life to serve. The night before the execution, Redoub stood at the edge of the camp, holding little Georgette against his chest while René Jean slept curled against his side and Gros Alain held his hand. Michelle sat nearby, silent, her eyes hollow again. He was a true hero. Redoub whispered to no one in particular. His voice was not steady. It was the voice of a man trying to hold something together that cannot be held together and holding it anyway, a real one. The morning of the execution came cold and still. Gauvain walked to the guillotine with the kind of calm that is not the absence of feeling but the mastery of it. He had made it his choice. He had made it with open eyes. He had no regrets, not in the way that matters, not in the deep. quiet place where a man's true self lives. He looked at the sunrise, that golden, indifferent, magnificent flood of light that comes every morning, regardless of what human beings do to one another. And something in his face was entirely at peace. Humanity has won, he said. His voice carried clearly in the morning air. This is the real victory. Simordain stood to one side, watching the man he loved more than anything in the world walk toward the blade he had condemned him to. His face showed nothing that a casual observer could read. But those who looked closely enough could see that something inside him was breaking, had already broken, in a way that would not be repaired. "My son," he whispered, so quietly that no one but the morning air. "I am killing you." The blade fell, and moments later Simordain, unable to carry the weight of what he had done, unable to live in a world where the logic of the revolution had required him to execute the person he loved most, took his own life. The revolution had consumed them both. The fortress of La Tourgue burned down to its foundations. The ancient stones that had stood for centuries, that had watched crusades and kingdoms and the slow turn of history's great wheels, collapsed into a heap of smoking rubble and ash. The siege was over. The last great stronghold of the royalist resistance in this corner of the Vendée was gone. Lantenac had vanished into the forest, still loyal, still unyielding, still the last guardian of a world that was passing away. The war would go on. It always does. Wars are difficult to end even when everyone is tired of them, even when the reasons for fighting have been consumed by the fighting itself. But in the ashes of La Tourgue, something remained. Something small. Something stubborn. Something that fire could not touch. Redoub walked out of the forest with Michel on one side and three children clutching his hands and his coat and his shoulders, chattering in the way that children chatter when they have recently been frightened out of their wits and are now, improbably, completely fine. He was grinning. The kind of grin that takes over a man's face before he even knows it's coming. The grin of someone who has been handed something he didn't know he wanted and has only just realized how much he needed it. "Now we are one family," he said. His voice was rough with feeling. Forever. Michel looked at him. This big, scarred, tender soldier who had carried her children on his shoulders through the worst days of her life. And she said, "You have given us a new life." And little Georgette, who was too young to understand most of what had happened, and who was therefore perhaps wiser than anyone, tugged on Redoub's coat and looked up at him with absolute certainty. "Papa Redoub," she said, "we are safe at last." Victor Hugo wrote 93 in 1874, more than 80 years after the events it portrays. He had lived through his own revolutions. He had watched Paris burn not once but twice. He had seen what happens when human beings reduce one another to symbols, when they stop seeing the person and see only the cause, the enemy, the obstacle, the traitor. He knew what the reign of terror had really been. He knew what civil war really costs. He knew in the bones of an old man who had buried friends and outlived enemies and watched history repeat itself, with maddening consistency, what the real battle always is. It is not the battle between republic and monarchy. It is not the battle between liberty and order, or progress and tradition, or any of the great abstractions that human beings are willing to kill for. The real battle, the only battle that has ever truly mattered, is the one inside the human soul, the battle between conviction and compassion, between the righteousness of a cause and the humanity of the person standing in front of you, between what the world tells you you must do and what you know in the quietest part of yourself is right. Lantenac, the old royalist warrior who had fought without mercy for a dying world, chose mercy for 3 children he did not know. It did not change his politics. It did not change his loyalties. It changed him, in the one way that cannot be undone. Gauvain, the young revolutionary who burned with genuine idealism, chose humanity over revolution. He paid with his life. But he paid without regret, because he understood something that Simordain never could, that a revolution which forgets to be human has already lost the only thing worth winning. And Simordain, brilliant, devoted, but unbreakable Simordain, chose the cause above the person he loved, and in doing so lost both 3 choices, 3 outcomes, and in the middle of all walking out of a burning fortress into a new morning, laughing and crying and holding on to each other, a family that had no business existing. that had been assembled by accident and tragedy and the inexplicable stubbornness of ordinary human love, that proved simply by existing that something survives even the worst that history can do, that something is us. At our best, at the moments when we are most fully what we are capable of being, we choose the child over the cause. We choose the person over the principle. We choose mercy over judgment, and love over law, and humanity over everything, even when it costs everything, especially then. Victor Hugo wanted us to understand one truth, one simple, ancient, indestructible truth that every generation must learn again for itself, in its own blood and fire and grief. In the end, when the fortresses have burned, and the armies have marched, and the guillotines have fallen, and the smoke has cleared, humanity wins. It always wins. Because it is the only thing that was ever worth fighting for.